I'm Ryan Lecoq. Welcome to my review of the 4th generation MrCool DIY split unit heating and cooling system. Wow, that was a mouthful. Now, since I imagine most of the folks watching this video are going to be people shopping for a heating and cooling system, not regular viewers of my channel, let me just explain real quick that I'm not a professional reviewer, nor am I a salesperson or an installer of HVAC systems, so I only have this one install of this one unit on my own house to go from, and that's all I'm basing my review on. So it's not going to be a comparison because I don't have experience with any other similar systems. It's also not going to be a tutorial, and I'm going to do a section at the end of do's and don'ts, and you'll see why you probably wouldn't want to follow a tutorial by us, but also how, as a consumer doing most of this yourself, you can get away with making a few little mistakes as long as you don't go too crazy, and it'll still work perfectly in the end, which ours does. Now, let me clarify what setup I got. Our house is 1,860 square feet. And by the way, I will be using all American systems of measurement. Sorry for people everywhere else. This is where I live. It's most convenient for me to not have to say things like Fahrenheit, English units, stuff like that all the time throughout the video. So bear with me on that. But anyway, 1,860 square feet. We're using 4 zones. Now, the handlers we have are 2 9K units, a 12K unit, and an 18K unit. And we are running that off a single 36K condenser unit. Now, you'll notice that that's actually more end units than what you are recommended to run off a single condenser, and that MrCool would actually recommend to you to use 2 26K condensers. But I'm going to explain the drawback of that and why we, based on just our own scientific knowledge, decided that this was going to work fine for our setup, and it in fact has, rather than letting ourselves be upsold. Usually salespeople or service people that you're going to talk to are always going to try and get you to buy the biggest one. They'll say, oh, just to be safe, and they won't give you the real world of, well, this is what it's really going to be like. And I can explain that to you of why we chose to do a 36K unit when we're using almost 50K of total potential in the handlers. Okay, so since I'm already out here by the condenser, let's start from the center and move out. That's actually always how my dad taught me to do everything with electrical, plumbing, everything like that. Start from the source, move your way out. So I'm going to start here talking about the hookup to the main condenser unit, and then I'll go and talk about the lines, and then I'll show the inside and the outside of the installation of the handlers and talk a little bit more about that. Finally, I'll end up inside the house, and I will talk about using the remotes, the bespoke app for this system, or connecting it to something like a Google Home or Amazon Alexa, which we've done. So let's just get started out here. Electrical. This is going to be, a lot of people probably have questions about the electrical on this. So let me just get right into it here and not waste any more of your time. I highly would recommend, if you live in the United States and you don't have any professional experience doing electrical, that you pay to have a professional do this. I'm going to reiterate this at the end of the video, but our total cost was just under $7,500, which is very reasonable for the system I just described. Hopefully we'll survive. And that's $5,200 for the parts, and then it was $2,060 was what the electrician charged me, and I gave him an extra $100 tip because it was murderously hot, and I don't know how he didn't die up on the roof up there. I feel like I should have given more, but that was all I could afford. So that brings us out to just under $7,500 with a few other miscellaneous charges for us to do the rest of the install. Now, that should be a pretty reasonable price, that even if you're a huge cheapskate like I am, you'll notice a pattern if you go through my reviews. I am like an epic cheapskate. So if I was willing to pay an electrician, and that sounds like too much for you for this scale of system, you are probably too cheap to get away with it. Just coming from a huge cheapskate, let me say that. So what this really comes down to is you have to do all of this in conduit. Everything, including the main line coming in and the lines going to all of the handlers. If you just read from the instructions, they're very vague about this, and they almost give you the impression that you could just take these. This is what the electrical lines look like that go to the handler units. and tape it to the bottom of these guys and cover it with insulative tape, and it'd be fine. And maybe that is legal in some places, but here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, we're at about 6,000 feet, and high temperatures in the summer get up to about 105. This would last maybe a month before this shrouding would start to crack, and you're going to start to have moisture getting inside, and this is all going to be ruined. So you really have to run it in conduit. Now, that part I think most people could figure out, even if you don't have fish rod or fish tape, how to, run this wire through a tube. But even then, you're going to get into other stuff that's just going to seem intimidating and not make sense to you if you're not an electrician. For example, the main line coming in here, to go to the 36K unit, you have to use really large number 6 conductor wires. And all of your wire bundle coming in here is going to be too large to fit through the holes in the cover. And so it seems weird that you would have to bore it out, but that's absolutely what you have to do, because you can't use smaller gauge wire and still pass inspection on this. Now, again, all of this, the only reason you ever have to do things right is to pass inspection. I would highly recommend, if you're doing something like this and you care about your home value at all, it is worth having an electrician do it, or if you can do it well enough yourself by following instructions and just figuring it out, which is not most of us. You do get it inspected and passed, and you get yourself a green card like this one right here, so that you can show that to anyone buying your home in the future. But anyway, beyond that, of just not even being able to hook it up, you're going to have to bore out one of these holes bigger to even get your wires in if you're using the larger 36K unit. And once you get in there, a number 6 wire is going to be way too big to go on. These are like little stereo terminals, like you find on a car amplifier, that you connect these wires onto, and the number 6 wires are too big. You have to cut them down before they'll even fit in those terminals. So even feeling comfortable doing that and knowing that that's something you can get away with, you honestly pretty much have to have professional electrical experience. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to give you any more information to where you can get yourself in trouble on the electrical. I'm just going to say that's my advice. You're going to have to find a tutorial somewhere else if you admit you have no professional experience and you want to do it anyway, even though I'm advising you not to. Good luck. I love you, but that's all I'm saying about it. Now, when it comes to these lines and hooking these up, these just go with hex brass fittings that you'll be pretty familiar if you have any experience with farm equipment, compressors, all kinds of stuff. Use brass, hex fittings. So it's nothing weird there. One thing that is going to throw a lot of people off, and even my dad, who's been doing all kinds of handyman stuff for years, he scratched his head at this, where it says make sure to use exactly, I think it says like 8 pounds of torque or something ridiculously low like that, which would make you think that, they say exactly, oh no, that you need to go and get an open-end digital HVAC torque wrench, which is like a $250 tool. And I don't even know if they probably have an adjustment to do such low amount of torque. But you can't take a socket, a normal torque wrench, and stick it on there. 8 pounds is tiny. Well, think about it. 8 pounds, if you have a reasonably strong hand like I do, that's one hand pushing it over. That's push it until it's tight. Don't freak out. Just tighten them. Don't get them cross-threaded. Tighten them on until they're tight and they don't leak. Seriously, we've been running this thing a month. It is that simple. 8 or 10 pounds is by hand. Now, if you have much smaller hands than mine, I don't know an exact measurement or mass for my hands, but you might need 2 hands. But anyone should be able to do it with 2 hands. So it's not, don't go out and buy a $250 digital open-end HVAC torque wrench. That's ridiculous. So you just twist them on until they're tight. Now, you will hear there's a seal inside that breaks, and it exchanges a little bit of air to equalize the pressure between the unit. Now, you don't want it shouldn't keep going, or that means you're losing coolant out of there, which is not good. But you should hear, when you connect the lines together and all the connections, you'll just hear a brief little when you break the seal. That's fine, that's okay, just make sure you keep tightening it all the way down so there's nowhere for any of that to escape to. One thing here is I actually wish we would have paid for slightly longer lines, because when we got down here, 2 of our lines just went straight into the condenser and had no extra room, and the other 2 barely have enough room for 1 loop. One thing that they do explain in the installation manual that is important and just makes sense if you understand fluid dynamics is you want to have these coils as horizontal as possible. because otherwise, if the system is turned off for a long period of time, this coolant is similar to what's in your car, in all kinds of other stuff. It has different components in it, heavier things like fluoride, that will settle down to the bottom. So if it's off for a long time and the heavy stuff settles down to the bottom, it'll pool up in the bottom of these coils and it'll clog up the lines. And then when you turn it on next, it'll blast this big clog of crap through and can potentially damage stuff, and it's not good. So what I'm gonna have to do is get like an upside down large plant pot or a plastic garbage can and cut it in half, something like that, and stick here and kind of like, I'll put a hook like for a garden hose to hold it on, because you want these to be like as flat horizontal as possible, and they're flexible enough that I can't just bend them that way and they'll hold. They have too much weight pushing against them for that to be a good idea. Okay, moving out from the main unit, that's just about everything you need to know that you shouldn't call a professional for. Mounting it on the ground, so we chose to just do 4x6s and then bolt into that. That's what's recommended. It comes with lag bolts and little rubber pads for vibration insulation. They make it seem like this thing is outrageously loud. It's on right now, blasting, and I don't know how bad this is going to come out in the end, being recorded through my microphone, but it's really not loud. It doesn't vibrate much. The lines make almost no noise. So the sound insulation tape is actually just used for its adhesiveness to hold everything solid. It doesn't really need to insulate the sound. This thing is not loud anywhere in the system. Even this unit is, I'm trying to think, it's like a refrigerator compressor from out in the middle of the kitchen, with it back against the wall. It's about that loud. It's not annoying at all. So moving up, this is our main, so what this is a GFI outlet after the power coming in. So this is just, in my state, you have to do this, you have to have a GFI at the end of every circuit. We're using a dedicated circuit coming out here. There was a 60-watt breaker for a hot tub out here, and the hot tub's long gone, so we just stepped it, or the electrician stepped it down to 45 watts. Came over here, put this GFI at the end, since we no longer have the rest of the system that all the lights and stuff were plugged into, with a GFI at the end of that. So this exists just for this. And then in here is its 45 amp fuse. Sorry, I said watts a minute ago, 45 amp. And so this is just to shut the whole system down. So because this is a separate circuit, this is just what you have to do to pass the inspection. Your system may be different. If you are able to just go directly to this and it's right next to your panel, and you have room to put a 45 amp fuse inside your main panel, then you might not have to do an exterior unit like this. Your mileage may vary. Let me just, quit rambling at that. So I think that's everything here at the main unit. Follow the instructions. Keep it at least 12 inches out from the house, because there has to be airflow going through it. That's how it works. Yep, that's it here at the main unit. Asterix. This is Asterix. I had to catch him real quick. He was trying to make a break for the gate. Quick addendum, because I forgot to specifically mention this. The big draw of this system is that it's pre-charged. So you don't have to pay an HVAC technician to come out and charge the lines with coolant for you. That should be pretty obvious to anyone who's looking at this system, because it's the big draw of it. But that's why I'm talking about stuff of like keeping it pressurized and tightening down the connections and stuff, is because this is a preloaded system. Just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Felt like a dumbass. Welcome to my roof. It is very bright up here, and I didn't want to lug the tripod up, so I'll try to make this section quick. And I also don't mind that we ran out of white tape here, so I've got some silver duct tape. I'm going to replace that later. But these lines, I just want to talk real quickly about that. It helps if you can put them like under something like a solar panel. We've got a bunch of solar panels up here, so we're able to run a lot of the lines underneath them to keep them shaded. But also don't paint them, because the reason this stuff on top of them is white reflective is so that it reflects as much heat as possible. Because obviously the hotter the lines themselves get when you're trying to run the system on cool, the less cool the coolant is when it gets to the end units. So just on that. But the other thing about actually running these is they say not to kink them. Now that's a hard bend. if you've got any experience with, copper lines of any kind on stuff that carries liquid or, gas or anything like that, you should know what we're talking about when you kink it over hard and it breaks it and, it blocks off flow and then it just leaks out a crack right there. That's what they're talking about. You can bend it around stuff that is at 90-degree angles. Just don't bend it off hard. So it's pretty flexible. You can bend it around pretty freely. We were able to run it all in between the solar panels and everything, try and keep as much of it shaded for as much of the day as possible. And we didn't break anything or have any leaks. So, just don't worry about that. Now at these joints right here, I forgot to take footage of these as we were putting them together, and I wanted to do my review after we'd been using the system for a month. So I'm sorry it's no longer accessible without me unpacking one of the connections midline. But the way they work is you have foam that you wrap, sorry, no, I've got the order wrong. You do sound insulation tape, which is actually being used for its stickiness. There's not a lot of noise coming out of these again. And then you put these foam wraps around it, and then you wrap it with the white reflective tape. So that's exactly like I said back at the unit, where you tighten them by hand until they're tight, and that worked perfect. There was no leaks. It hasn't leaked any since. It's been working perfectly. So yeah, just mostly don't freak out about this stuff. It is mostly like it seems for that part. The whole connecting the lines worked just fine DIY, and there was nothing that really freaked us out while we were doing it. For the last outdoor part of talking about the description of the system itself and basics on installation, this is where our line comes in from outside into the air handler. So you can see we've got our coolant lines right here, electrical and the flexible conduit, and then here's the drain coming out. Now, when they talk about putting the air handlers up and sticking the lines through the wall, so you're going to have an electrical lead coming out of here, you're going to have two connections with hex fittings for the coolant, and then you're going to have, it comes off about here, and then you can attach any length of hose you want on here to drain. They're going to be very specific that the one thing about this that matters is that the drain hose needs to stay on the bottom, and that the tube itself needs to be at a slightly downward angle. It's pretty simple. This is your condensation drain of the extra condensation from the outside of the lines where the air blows through it inside the unit. So if that's pulling up inside, it's going to leak out the front of the unit into your house. You want your drainage to go outside and leak into a little gravel patch like I've got going on down here. So just make sure that it stays on the bottom. They recommend that you use some of their provided insulation tape to wrap around them just to keep the bundle the same way you have it when you stick it through, so that this doesn't try to slip around to the top, because if it goes over one of the other lines, that's going to be enough to trap the unit and make it pull up in there, and that'll be no good. Now, as far as what you take from this, the really nice thing is they give you lots and lots of extra drain line. This stuff is pretty flimsy, so I imagine this is going to crack and get crappy, and I'll have to cut another segment off this and replace it. They give you tons and tons of extra, so don't worry about it. Just run it out in the sun is fine. It's going to get destroyed, but you got all of this, and if you somehow run out of all the spare they give you, this is just half-inch drain line. You can get this at any home improvement store. It's not a weird or rare thing. So don't worry about running out of this or how long it's going to last or anything. This stuff is super cheap. You just pop it off of this connector right here where it comes out, and you can just, boom, pop another length on and cut it off any length you want. No problem. Now, as far as connecting it to the other lines, I've already talked a bunch about the brass hex fittings and all of that, but I just wanted to show you what all this stuff looks like. So again, this is the insulation tape that they give you that they recommend wrapping around all of the places where there are connections. This isn't actually adhesive, just the very end of it is adhesive, and this just keeps, like, it reflects sunlight back off. That's the point of this. So besides just a little extra wrapping, this doesn't seal in or out moisture. You're actually going to have moisture that's going to evaporate out of this. And so it's, don't freak out trying to wrap this up like a mummy. It just holds stuff on and keeps sunlight out. This is our sound dampening mat. If you are into car stereos or you have a band that tries to practice responsibly and you built your own jam space, you're probably familiar with something like this. It's just adhesive sound deadening mat. And it actually, again, these connections don't really make any noise. It's just basically for its adhesive, sticky properties seems to be why they used it, because you can just stick it right around the connections you've made, and it just seals it all up nice so a bunch of dirt and crap doesn't get in there. These go around on top of that, so this insulates heat. Foam, it's just insulating the heat, keeping it, cold or warm inside when it's cold or warm outside. Oh yeah, and then this stuff goes on last. Now, they don't provide for you any duct tape. I mentioned on some of the lines up on the roof, we ran out of white duct tape. This is Duck brand duct tape, which I don't recommend. This stuff sucks. Should have got some 3M, but I couldn't find it in white. So I highly recommend using white, and we use this just to seal the ends of that tape so it doesn't just flop off everywhere when it starts to kind of constrict from being exposed to sunlight. Just because it's going to look better using white tape instead of silver. So you may have to use inferior tape like I did in order to find it in white, but especially since a lot of these connections are going to be down here in view on your house, I would recommend at least doing that. Again, don't paint any of this. Like, don't paint it the color of your stucco. The reflectiveness is important for reflecting heat. Okay, let's see here. Now, last things on the insulation, they're going to mention this in the instructions 2 or 3 times, but you're going to want a 3.5-inch hole saw to make the hole to put the tube through. I highly recommend getting a carbide tip one, because depending on what your material is, like I have stucco, so underneath there's chicken wire and cement underneath the actual stucco, and a weaker bit might go through this outer stucco, but as soon as you hit that cement and chicken wire, one of these will tear through anything. A carbide tip bit will just make a hole through damn near anything. So just spend the $23 or whatever that it costs to buy these at Lowe's and Home Depot, and just start with one of these rather than thinking you can get away with a weaker bit to make this hole. With one of these, it takes like a couple seconds. You just go, and your hand's sticking out the outside or inside wall. I recommend going from the inside, so all the crap comes flying out here. To fill the hole, final part on this section, they give you this clay. Now, to me, I just didn't feel like this was enough material. It's a little tiny block of clay, like this big. And the tube, the thickness of my wall is about like that. So it just didn't feel like much material to plug up the hole. So on top of that, I put expanding foam, and I also put some inside the wall around the tube. And then on the outside here, I'm going to put stucco patch up around it and paint the edge. And I just, bugs are insane here. We have really angry, militant carpenter ants and cockroaches. So I just didn't like the idea of there being any extra space in there, or it being just thin clay that some beetle could just push out of the way. So, a lot of people have strong opinions about using expanding foam or not. You definitely don't want it exposed to sunlight. It's not super heavy duty. But if you do like this, where you spray it around in the edge underneath and then cover it with stucco patch so it's not exposed, not a big deal. This is going to depend a lot on climate and where they're located. This one's undercover. Some of my other ones are out on walls that are exposed to sunlight and rainwater. This may or may not seem like enough ceiling to plug up this hole in here around these. Your mileage may vary. Call me an idiot in the comments if you want. That's what I chose to do, and I think it's going to look pretty good once I just stucco patch up around the edge of this plastic, and I'll just know that it's all filled in there with some nasty material the bugs don't really like chewing through. To wrap up our tour here of the installation itself and how DIY it is, I guess I should say, we're in here at the air handler inside the house. Now, there's not too much I have to add beyond the instructions on putting these up. Use the template they include. That's going to make it a lot easier. Don't just throw away all the packaging without paying attention. They do include a template for putting the hanger frame up on the wall. So make sure you don't accidentally recycle that before you start. Just saying that. Now, they include a bunch of wall anchors, saying that you could even put the whole thing in just hanging from sheetrock. It's true these are not very heavy, but I never hang anything in sheetrock. On all of mine, I made sure to hit 2 studs and have at least 4 screws hitting studs. And then there was a couple other ones I added in anchors just to it's a fairly flimsy plate. So, I was worried that I might hook the edge with the unit and bend the whole plate. So I put in a couple more just to hold the lips down so I didn't accidentally hook them and bend them out and mess my installation plate all up. But just, bare minimum, at least hit one stud and put 2 screws in a stud will stop this thing from falling off the wall. I like as much stability as possible because things happen. Kids love to hang on things. Footballs get thrown inside the house. I don't remember whose commercial that was, but it happens. Beyond that, again, make sure the tube is at a slight downward angle when you put it through the wall. There's a notch in the ring that goes around this side of the tube for the part that's leaning up against the wall, so you can get it as close as possible so that it doesn't push the unit out from the wall or anything. Again, the reason for that is just so that the drain tube goes downward and you don't get water flowing back out the front of your unit and down the wall. It should go right on the template. It's just got 4 hooks on there, 2 on top, 2 on bottom, and it just hangs on there and the tubes go through the wall. There's nothing complicated going on here. You could put this all kinds of weird or ugly or crooked or funky. I know in our house, neither our ceilings or our floors are level, so it was a pain just getting it even to what we decided was going to be straight. None of that is a big deal. As long as your tubes are going slightly downward and they line up with the hole and this thing doesn't fall off the wall, it's able to do its purpose. There is one other thing to be aware of is if you have to run lines longer than 25 feet like I did, these come with 25-foot lines attached to them for power. So if you have to swap out to 50 or 75 foot, you're going to have to change the connection yourself up inside the unit. This whole plate pops open, there's a little electrical panel over there, and it's the same thing as the main unit where it's like little stereo terminals. Now fortunately, these have little spade connectors on them and they're labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know, the ground is not labeled, the ground is the ground. It's green, it's pretty obvious where it goes in there. But you just put, spade number 1 and socket number 1, they're labeled in there. It's pretty easy to do, but they suck. It's like a cheap stereo amplifier, so you may have to fiddle around with those connections in order to get the spade connectors to go in there, and it is a bit of a pain, but it can be done by a non-expert. I managed to get them in there eventually with some patience and being careful not to snap anything off in there or lose any of the screws. But just be aware, if you do have to go longer than 25 feet, you're going to need to swap out the power cable because that's the length that came on all of the handlers. So wrapping up the basics of just the overview of the system and the DIY install, the reason I went into so much detail on this, even though I'm not doing a tutorial here, is because this is billed as a DIY air conditioning and heating system. And so one of the biggest questions you're going to have is how DIY is it? So I hope I gave you the complicated answer to that through this first section of the video, but to put it ultra simple, the electrical is not at all DIY unless you know what you're doing or you have the amazing ability to read instructions of something you've never seen before and figure it out the right time and do it without breaking anything. If you're not in one of those 2 categories, it really does make sense to hire a professional electrician to do the electrical aspect of this install. Beyond that, of running the lines, hanging the units, now I do want to say I'm looking to do a little career change, but I have been a professional low volt installer, so making holes in the wall and hanging things, I do that all the time, security cameras, TVs, speakers, all kinds of different stuff. So, it may take you a little practice to hit studs right, get the hanger up perfect, but it's all going to be covered by the large unit itself. It is pretty easy to do if you follow the instructions, even if you don't have a lot of experience. Hooking the lines together, as soon as we figured out not to freak out about the exact 8 pounds of torque or whatever it was asking for, and stuff like that, it all went together. We were able to do it in a few days, just my wife and I, having no HVAC experience or understanding. But have your electrical done professionally is my recommendation. So I'm not going to answer a bunch of questions in the comments where people think, oh, if I just answered one more question for them, they could, do the electrical themselves. I chose to hire a professional, A, because I wanted it to easily get it all permitted the first time and just be able to have it done and walk away. But B, because even, with a fair amount of knowledge of all kinds of tinkering and stuff that I do, I decided that it was smarter to have someone with experience and with comfort do it. So that's where I'm leaving that. That's my final review on the DIY aspect of this. It is very DIY, but I don't recommend doing the electrical for most people. Let's talk about how you actually operate this thing once you've got it installed. So the system itself is going to come with one of these remotes for each of the air handlers or each of the zones that you have. which actually you can combine two in the same zone in your setup on the app and everything. But just to look at it in a simple way, if you only had remotes, each of these would control one unit and you would control the temperature on them individually by keeping the correct remote in the same room with the unit. That would be the most simple way. You should also get at least one of these wireless thermostats. Now this is nice, it doesn't take a 4-pin wire, it's totally wireless and you just put batteries in it. So you just stick it on the wall anywhere you want. It doesn't matter. It doesn't require power or communication connection through a wire or anything like that. Now I would say don't put it so securely on the wall that you can't get it off and get the battery cover off. But there's no restriction. They even have little hangers that come with all of these that you can put on the wall and you can hang it in a little holster if you wish. Now going from there, we have what most people with fairly modern technology are probably going to want to do, which is either control it through an app on your smartphone or hook it up to something like Amazon Alexa or Google Home. We use Google Home and control it through that. All I had was a cheap Fire tablet because I don't use much Amazon stuff. But anyway, there's a few things about this that make it slightly more complicated than it seems. Now the first is that you are only able to set this app up and connect to the devices over a 2.4 gigahertz network. Now it's possible that maybe we got old wireless adapters. The wireless adapters are a little USB part that comes with each air handler. So I would assume that they're the newest ones for the 4th generation system, but maybe somehow we got old ones, but the ones we got definitely do not connect at all through 5 gigahertz. So just be aware of that. If you have something like a little hotspot or something that only does a single wireless network and only has the option of 5 gigahertz, you're going to probably have to go get something like a range extender that you can access the firmware of and do a bunch of trickery and nonsense to get it to work and even set it up in the first place. It does not work like most other Alexa and Google Home compatible devices where you connect with Wi-Fi direct directly from your phone or tablet to the thing and then connect it through its own interface to its own app, and then it makes the connection and can be accessible anywhere on your wireless network, usually over your cellular. It doesn't really matter. It just has to make the initial connection. But just be aware, our system at least only functioned with 2.4 gigahertz. So you're going to have to be able to set up a 2.4 gigahertz network to set it up. Now, beyond that, a lot of folks are probably going to want to connect it to a Google Home like we did, Amazon Alexa, some sort of smart home setup. And that is going to get a little more complicated. Before I move on, let me mention one other thing that was missing from the instructions on ours. Now, in order to pair these all in the first place, you have to put them in pairing mode, which is not mentioned in the 4th generation instruction booklet. And the only way we found this is my genius wife thought, why don't we check the last generation booklet and see if they accidentally omitted something? Sure enough, they did. A key step that you cannot connect these without. You need to push this LED button right here on the remote 7 times to put the wireless adapter in pairing mode and get each of these to pair. So unless you are as smart as my wife and you thought to maybe see if they forgot a section from the old instruction manual, you're going to be tearing your hair out. And yeah, so just remember that if you go, I may do a full tutorial on that if enough people ask me, and if I'm feeling really motivated. I hate making tutorials, but those are probably the things you're missing. Now moving on to connect it to your smart home apps. Again, you may run into some weirdness here of most of us probably have our Google Home or Amazon Alexa on our higher frequency 5 gigahertz band. So once you get it set up with its own app and then you want to connect through there so that you can operate it all on your, your main control panels that you do everything in your house with through your Google Home app or Amazon app, you may then have to switch networks or do something to get it to show up. It can be a little bit of a pain. But the end final version of it is I only honestly would give this system an A+ for usability once you go through the whole difficult, not well explained process of bypassing their app and controlling everything through your Google or Amazon or Apple or whatever you've got that have better apps. Because once we were able to control it all with Google's app, it worked perfectly. We love it. It's simple. It's easy to set schedules, but the app that comes with it is pretty crappy. And just getting that set up on most phones and stuff to where it even works, where you don't constantly have to switch back and forth between your Wi-Fi bands to even get the stuff to show up and work properly, it's a pain. So I would say, if you just are going to do it with the remotes, you'll probably be pretty happy and not have much trouble with them. They work pretty well. You can turn the lights on the face on and off. You can turn the beeps on and off so it doesn't beep every time you turn it on or off or change a setting. So you can make it, they're very, very quiet when it's all set up. So yeah, it's easy to make it silent. It's easy to make it not have bright lights on it. You can change all the settings well with the remote. For your basic use, I have no real complaints about that. Once you get it working on your smart home software, I have no real complaints about that because it works the same way everything else will if you're used to that. It's in the middle where if you just are using their app on your phone or if you're struggling to get it connected, that it is absolute hell. And so I would have to overall for the the smart software usability, I'd have to give it like a C or a 60% or something like that, because it took a lot of BS that would be pretty hard for people that don't, my wife and I, we both work in tech, so we're at least a little bit more inclined to figure out this BS, whereas to some people it may be about undoable without then having to pay an additional cost to bring a tech professional to their house. So just be aware of that. You're not going to have too much trouble with this, I wouldn't imagine. And once you get it running on a well-made app, it works fine. But everything in the middle is awful. We have finally made it to the do's and don'ts section, which could be the most useful part of this video. I'm not sure. I'm not the person still needing to install it. But this is the stuff that we learned from doing our first DIY heating and cooling system install. Now, probably the biggest thing I would say is make sure to plan your install ahead as much as you can. Shipping anything is getting hard to predict and hard to count on these days. It took a while for our stuff to show up, about 3 or 4 months from when we initially ordered it. I think it was maybe 2.5, something like that. But it ended up where we got to the hottest part of the year before we were actually installing it, rather than, it was like late spring when we first started coming up with the idea to do the project and got to that point in our home DIY remodel we're doing. And so, yeah, when it's the hottest is definitely the worst, especially if this is our second part of maybe it's very stressful doing a do-it-yourself install if your other heating and cooling system has already broken. So our old swamp cooler we've been using that's like almost 50 years old has, it's been crotchety, it's made a lot of noises, it started to smell kind of funny, but it still worked and kept us alive for the last few years. Well, right before we got all the last parts and started doing the install on the MrCool, our swamp cooler's motor finally kicked the bucket. And, my cheapness, I wasn't willing to put a new, turbine motor in an old swamp cooler that's just nasty and rusted and giving up the go when we already have the parts for the MrCool. So my wife and I we bought a portable air conditioner, which there's going to be a bonus review today on the portable air conditioner, but it was a 350 square foot portable air conditioner, and we had to tape off a little section of our bedroom to stay alive in. And everywhere else out in the house, outside, it was about 105 degrees that week, or it took us about 2 weeks. And so it was just a hellish week of, my wife and I snapping at each other because we're just too hot, and it was frustrating trying to figure stuff out. So yeah, plan ahead to make sure you get all the stuff in time so you don't find yourself doing it at a time when it's uncomfortable, when it's raining outside, when there's snow, when it's the hottest part of the year. And also, a DIY installation of you and your spouse, you and your friends, you and your family, it can get real stressful. So if you are in one of those times where it's really hot, it's raining, there's anything that adds exacerbation to the experience of installing it, I would definitely say be wary of that, because you are going to have to figure some stuff out. There is some weirdness in the instructions. There's some head scratching. As I pointed out in the app part, there's stuff where they just straight up didn't put something in the instructions that you needed. And that's the kind of stuff that can lead to you shouting at each other. And as wonderful as the system is and as happy with it as I am, it wouldn't have been worth a divorce. So be mindful of that. Now, as far as, other do's and don'ts, we didn't make any other huge mistakes, but there are a few little ones. We tried to order our lines as short as possible to save money, and they all fit fine. But as I showed outside, 2 of the lines, they just barely came into where they got there. If I had like an inch less or something, we wouldn't have been able to attach them. We would have had to get another extension. I don't know what the shortest length is they make, I can't remember. but it would have definitely been more expensive ordering attachments or extensions and attaching more on there. So, and then the other ones, I didn't have enough coil to make multiple loops and have it sit on the ground, or have enough, structure that I could loop it together and it would hold on its own. So I just have barely enough to make one coil of each, and I got to rig something up. Anyway, if you're not blowing your budget up and it's, a couple $100 on a $5,000 system isn't going to break the bank, make sure you get lines that are plenty long enough, because it's going to make everything easy. And the line it's pretty easy to bend, as I said. It's not hard if you just get like a plastic garbage can and you have 3 or 4 loops extra on the end of each of them. It's not going to be the end of the world. It has enough power to push them out. That's, it's not a big deal. The other thing here is, I mentioned I would go into this more at the end, but how it went for us having a single 36K condenser and 4 units that total up to almost 50K of, I don't even remember what measurement unit they said that is. Sorry, on the boxes it just says K. I have to guess look it up what exactly what it is. But anyway, we're not able to run all 4 handlers at the maximum amount all the time. The pump is not able to push enough. It's not able to pump out enough hot air and create cooler. I'm not going to go into the details of how a heat pump works, because I probably don't fully understand. But basically, it's only able to create so much cooling total per hour based on how big of a pump you have. And so if you couldn't cool it, like if it was way too hot and you needed to have all of them blasting too much to try and cool a large area, you would run out of juice and it wouldn't be able to cool basically at all, or it would take a really, really long time to drop it in temperature. Now that's true, but the fact is it was high 90s when we turned the system on. It was probably that hot or hotter inside the house. And we turned up the whole system and had all of them going on like 60% fan, and it cooled the house down in 4 hours. This is Albuquerque, New Mexico. We're, extreme UV and heat. There's, a few places in the world where it gets hotter than this and has more extremes between hot and cool, but I don't think it's actually a real world scenario. It's something the salespeople will say on the phone to try and get you to buy another condenser, but I just can't imagine. It would have to be like such a sudden spike in heat and record temperatures out of nowhere. I mean, we're talking like a 25 to 30 degree Fahrenheit shift overnight, which, maybe every once in a while happens when there's an extreme storm, but it's just not particularly realistic. And even when we were trying to cool the house 30 degrees, it didn't do it instantly, but it did do it in 4 hours and cooled it to a comfortable temperature, going from about 100 to, about 70, I think was what we cooled it down to that first night. So yeah, you aren't going to be able to run all of them at max. Now you don't want to go too far beyond that. If you go too much, you're just not going to be able to push any significant cooling or heating out at all, and it's just going to barely ooze out. And if it does suddenly get too hot, or you come home after leaving the system off or turned down low for a while, it's not going to be able to cool, because again, the way a heat pump works, it's only able to cool or heat so many degrees per the space and the size of the pump per hour. That's just how it works. So you're going to reach a point where it's frustration, but if you're pretty close, like you're at 60 to 70% of the capacity of the max capacity that the handlers could put up is the power of your pump, it still works pretty well. A lot of people are not going to be trying to run such a large system with the absolute minimal amount of condenser like we did. I've seen most of the installed videos and setups I've seen, people are just running like a single handler or something in a garage in one room, or they're installers just doing a demonstration. So I just basically want to say that if you do the extreme of like the biggest amount you think you could possibly support and try to get away with slightly less pumping power, it is doable. It's worked fine for us. We haven't had any problems. I'll do an addendum video if it suddenly explodes one day and I find out that was the reason, but that's what you're going to run into. It's not going to be able to run all of them at full. And if, say, we didn't need the kitchen one on, or we just shut the guest room door and didn't have that one on, the other 3 can blow at full all day long. So really, it's like, do you need to have all of your handlers if you had 4 zones like we did and you're a little under on the size of your condenser? Would you ever need to run them all at full blast? It's not real likely. But if you did, you could with this setup. So in conclusion on how happy am I with this system, I haven't really said much about how I feel. This is amazing. I want to just specify that I'm someone who's never had, a real digital controlled heating and cooling system. The Dodge Challenger I just sold was the first car I ever had with climate control. So I'm used to things that either blow full hot or full cold, and you have to moderate that by, fans and things like that. Like, I grew up with a wood stove heated house and fans for cooling where we just blew air through the house. And, now here in New Mexico, I've had one large swamp cooler in the middle of the house to cool the whole house. And it just blasts out frigid, cool air and is really loud and a lot of air movement right under it. And then you've got to try and force the air out into the rest of the house. And we got a gas wall heater, nothing ever like this where it did any of the stuff this is. So, it is a huge jump in technology compared to the rest of my experience. But I can't imagine it gets much better than this, honestly, besides if you consider the units on the wall unsightly. You never hear it, you don't notice it. It has louvers to move the airflow up and down, so it's not always blowing in the same direction. So you don't really feel much airflow, and you pretty much just set it and forget it. You walk around the house. If you've got a smart home setup, it's really easy to just set schedules and everything on it. And you just never think about heating and cooling again. I'm comfortable all the time, and I never think it's like a dream I never imagined was possible from my personal experiences. And for how cheap we did it and how much we've increased the value of our home with this and other things where we've been brave enough to DIY, take a little risk snapping at each other, hoping our marriage is strong enough to survive it. And I really feel this one, like a lot of the other ones, was worth it. It feels as honestly as ritzy as I can imagine for a heating and cooling system from my limited experience, but it is wonderful. I never wake up sweating or freezing at night. We'll see in the winter. I would imagine it heats just as well as it cools, but it's been like a dream and we love it. Final thing, I chose to set up the air handlers in the 2 bedrooms where they blew at the bed, just because my wife and I are the type of people that when it's the hottest time of the year or the coldest time of the year and we come in from walking the dogs and we're just hot and sweaty or cold and shivering, we want to just jump in the bed and blast whatever the opposite temperature is on us and just be warm or cold as fast as possible. So, again, it's not much air movement or noise. It's not really going to bother you, but some people might not want to do it that way. Personally, if you have that same feeling that I do, totally do that. Do it where it blows straight out of the bed, because it is so nice in the middle of summer. You just come in hot and sweaty, you just lay flat on the bed, flip it on with your phone, or it's usually already on and it just blows cold air straight on you. It is wonderful. So that about wraps it up for this review. I'm really happy with it. It was cheap. We managed to get through it without screwing it up or breaking it. For the month that I've had it going, it's been perfect. It's been better than I could have hoped for. Just remember those little things that I said in between. This has ended up being a pretty long review, but from my perspective, this is a lot of investment, even for the cheapest system like this you could possibly put together. I was about ready to put another swamp cooler on top of the house. So this was a much better investment. It's a much better result. And I'm really glad we decided to take the risk of doing something, pretty new seeming, a DIY heating cooling system. This one's a strong recommend. Look forward to my bonus review today on the portable air conditioner that kept us alive until we could get this installed. I think I have that the most to thank for keeping my marriage alive through this. Thanks for watching.